This is
Make It Plain.
Make It Plain.
MIP
With Masamela Matfumo.
Mark Thompson.
Make It Plain.
Get woke.
Do you ever feel like life is a never-ending series of lessons while you try to find purpose, meaning, and answers? I am Vanessa Fontana, the host of Figuring Shit Out, a podcast where we undertake self-help, coming of age, and healing. As I live my 20s in New York City figuring shit out myself, I've realized that if you spend your whole life trying to get your act together, you don't have a life. You have an act. On Figuring Shit Out, every Sunday, you get to normalize the journey of not knowing and be guided into living your life with more intention and ease.
Ladies and gentlemen, happy to have with us a dear brother who's with the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, the NCRC. He's also a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. Over the years, we've always relied on him for information about how far we have or have not progressed since Dr. King's untimely martyrdom. He used to author the State of the Dream report, and that was something we always look forward to hearing about and getting caught up on. Now there's a new report as we approach the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington. Still a dream, over 500 years to Black economic equality. Our dear brother, Dedrick Asante Muhammad, joins us once again on Make It Plain. Brother, how are you?
Yes, sir. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you.
Good. Glad to be on.
And it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you for your continued work in this area, and you highlight some of the things that we have achieved, but also some of the things we've not. So I kind of, if you don't mind, Dedrick, I kind of want to go through some of the key findings. Poverty. Where have we come? Have we overcome? Dr. King would say we shall overcome. Have we overcome the disparity in the poverty rate since 1963, the March on Washington?
We haven't overcome the disparity in poverty, but we've seen great improvements in that. And I think it's helpful for younger generations to understand. In 1963, 51% of African Americans lived in income poverty. So the majority of African Americans lived in income poverty. And we saw actually, with the war on poverty, with a lot of the programs that the Black freedom struggle of the 50s and 60s helped get to push forward, we saw by 1969 that poverty rate had decreased to about 35%, right around there. And in 2021, we're down to about 20%. Now, 20% poverty rate is still high. That's still 1 out of 5 Black Americans, but it is substantively lower than the poverty rate of 51% that we were seeing during the time of the March on Washington.
What was the white poverty rate in 1963, and what is the white poverty rate now in comparison?
Yes. And so, again, Blacks had a 51% poverty rate in 1963. Whites had a poverty rate of 15% in 1963. And in 2021, Blacks had a poverty rate of 20%, while whites had a poverty rate of 8%. So both saw a substantive decline during this 60-year period. And that's, that is important, but there's still, great disparity. But again, I would say in 2021, African Americans have a little bit more, maybe around 2.5 times the poverty rate of whites, while back in 63, they had, over 3 times the poverty rate. So some bridging, I think some improvement, we can be, we should acknowledge that. And I think we'll see in other areas that we haven't seen even that type of improvement. And I think many people would argue, I think Dr. King would have argued, 60 years of the March on Washington, he would have desired complete equality in terms of socioeconomic characteristics. We're not near that on really about any measure.
Talk to us about education, high school attainment, college attainment. How far have we come since 1963?
Sure, and I think that's also something that's important for younger generations to understand, that the Black high school attainment rate back in the early 60s was about 25%, meaning high school graduates, only about 25% of African Americans had high school diplomas. And by 2022, we're at 90%. So we see that, there's been a great increase there, and Blacks and whites are about almost equal in terms of white high school attainment now. Let's look at, no, I think a big difference now is that people are expected to go much farther in education today than they were previously. We can look at college attainment, and we can see that the college attainment between blacks and whites has narrowed from about whites had a 2.4 times more likely to graduate from college in the 60s, now to 1.7 times. So you have black college attainment at about 28% today, and white college attainment at about 38% today. So there's been, definitely increases for blacks and whites in high school attainment, college attainment, some bridging of that divide, but we still have a substantive divide in terms of particularly college education.
I guess we would need to be concerned too that what just happened with affirmative action could ultimately impact that number and take us backwards, right?
Well, yeah, I think we definitely want to make sure. I think affirmative action, but I think even a greater threat is the rising cost of higher education, and you're not getting the same type of economic benefit that you had in the past. And I think that's even a greater threat of being priced out. I think affirmative action, oftentimes, a lot of its greatest change has occurred in the most elite universities. But I am concerned that if we don't deal with the financing of education, that we could, see a turn back just based on that, not even taking into consideration affirmative action.
Yeah, that's a good point. Unemployment. We're hearing these numbers, record low black unemployment. Obviously, that's better than things were in 1963, correct?
Correct. Definitely. We've seen that unemployment, we hit like almost a record low, which of 5% back about a year or so ago. And since about 2018, we've seen a decent amount of 5 and 6% unemployment rate for blacks, which are kind of record lows if you take out the 18-month COVID recession. In the 70s to mid 90s, black unemployment was constantly in the double digits. From 1994 to 2017, you saw black unemployment between 7 and 10%. So I think over the last 5 years, we've seen some improvement. And the question is, can we maintain that? And can we improve upon that? Can we keep, not only just keep African-American unemployment around 5 or 6%, but get that down to the 3 and 4% that white unemployment is regularly at?
Yeah. Right. Can you keep that down? That's the question. Well, as you very aptly pointed out, the challenge in higher education, while most people are focused on affirmative action, do you see any pitfalls, any red flags that would suggest we might begin to go backwards when it comes to black employment or black unemployment?
I think my greatest concern is that we oftentimes do not maintain the progress that blacks do attain in an economy. And so just historically, we might hit a low, but then during the next recession, we go back to where we were and might even go beyond that. So I think that's the concern. And the economy is so weird ever since this post-COVID, no one's really clear where we are. Are we about to head into a recession? Have we skipped a recession? We probably won't really know until we get into another recession and see if we're able to still keep black unemployment, if it doesn't jettison up to 10%, but can still keep it fairly low even for a recession. So I think, time will tell, but I do think we've learned some important policy programs that can really be helpful, and that we really do need to expand unemployment benefits to those who are self-employed, maintain or make sure we have strong unemployment benefits that keep dollars in people's pockets so they don't go into financial ruin just because they've hit an unemployment spell. So I think hopefully we could have learned those lessons in COVID. We won't know if we've learned them until we use them again in future recessions.
Other areas of importance, income, how much money we're making in comparison to white Americans, median household income. talk to us about that and what progress, if any, we've made in those areas.
Yeah, this is where we've seen much slower progress. For every dollar of white family income, African Americans had 58 cents on the dollar in 1967 for every white dollar of income. In 2021, African Americans had 62 cents on every dollar of white household income. So it took 60 years to make 4 cents of improvement. And, that type of progress is what I would call a lack of progress. It would take, if we keep going 4 cents for 60 years, it would take another 500 years for African Americans to reach just income equality with white Americans. And I think, that should be a slap in the face to us, to our society. Dr. King was saying in 1963 that we can't accept a cool gradualism, that we have to deal with the fierce urgency of now. But yet 60 years later, we're still on a path of maybe 500 years from now getting just income equality between blacks and whites. So that, that should be unacceptable, should be considered a crisis, and should be a rallying point as we remember the March on Washington for freedom, for jobs and freedom, and what that march was about.
Also, the report discloses median household income for African Americans only grown 0.36% since the turn of the century. Yeah,
that's right. It's and so again, if you want to just do the last 20 years, no matter what you look at, the last 60 years, the last 20 years, we are not on a path of racial economic equality. Oftentimes people will say, well, we're not where we want to be, but we're getting there. And our report's highlighting, no, we're not getting there in terms of income and wealth, which means we need a radical shift in our approach, radical shift in policy, and I think a radical investment in our communities if we do want to get past the racial inequality the country was founded upon.
So we gained only 4 cents for every dollar of white family income. African Americans only gained 4 cents. And if I'm reading this correctly, we only gained 6 cents for every dollar of wealth, too, right?
That is right. And we've gained that 6 cents, but we were starting at 12 cents on every dollar of wealth for whites in 1962. And by 2019, we're at 18 cents. So, we're still at a much worse space in wealth equality than we are with whites. And at that rate, it would take almost 800 years for African Americans, 780 years for African Americans to reach wealth equality. And I think wealth is the strongest indicator of socioeconomic status in our society. So again, the country is on a path of ongoing what I would call economic apartheid between blacks and whites. And the question is, will the country, as Dr. King was calling for, finally, develop the will and move us from the chaos to a beloved community that he was working so hard for.
Yeah.
Do you ever feel like life is a never-ending series of lessons while you try to find purpose, meaning, and answers? I am Vanessa Fontana, the host of Figuring Shit Out, a podcast where we undertake self-help, coming of age, and healing. As I live my 20s in New York City figuring shit out myself, I've realized that if you spend your whole life trying to get your act together, you don't have a life. You have an act. On Figuring Shit Out, every Sunday, you get to normalize the journey of not knowing and be guided into living your life with more intention and ease.
And by now, folks, you can tell when Derek talks about the centuries it would take to close these gaps. I often, brother, as you know, quote you when I'm speaking. And there's always a dramatic point when I make it. People receive it dramatically when you say it takes 500 years. I want to move into home ownership because you talk about that as well. I still have my notes from your State of the Dream reports. In 2004, you wrote this, that it would take the black home ownership rate for it to close back in 2004, it would take 1,664 years to close the home ownership gap, about 55 generations. Has that gotten any better, or are we still looking at 1,664 years?
Yeah, I would say once you start getting to 1,000 years, I just say we're not making progress at all. And I think that's what current data is showing. And you're aging me by showing that I've been writing about this for about 20 years. But it is true that Black home ownership in 1960 was 38%. And in 2021, meaning 38% of African Americans were homeowners. In 2021, 44% of African Americans are homeowners. In 1960, 64% of white Americans were homeowners. So I think one way to think about it is we're still 20% behind where whites were in 1960. Wow. And then in 2021, whites are at 74% homeowners. And so again, I always point to history. Whites weren't always majority homeowners. Whites became majority homeowners through the GI Bill, through restructuring mortgage lending, through government backing mortgage loans. And I think it's going to be that type of focused federal government investment into Black home ownership, I say into Latino home ownership, into Native American home ownership, if we want America to be majority homeowners in the future, and if we want to rectify that Black-white inequality. So again, it's going to take a whole kind of a new deal, a new GI Bill, a new 0% down government-backed mortgage lending to make a community like African Americans whose median income's around $45,000 and median wealth's around $9,000. Got to create some new mortgage products that are subsidized if we're going to make us majority homeowners.
Yeah. No, that's important. And that, folks, that's, as Diedrich is describing, and I mean to age you, folks, for the record, he started writing these reports when he was 10. He was 10 years old. He was, just a child prodigy. We were all so impressed with him. And as you talk about those solutions, yes, that's that, because a lot of folks think, white folks, I remember you wrote a piece also on the Commons. I won't tell you that one either, but you laid that out. And I also have referred to that in the context of our conversation about reparations. White folks got that help. People think white folks just woke up at night and they just middle class. No, they had help to establish the middle class through the GI Bill, as you said, in the Commons, the Homestead Act, FHA loans. They had all of those things. We didn't even have Social Security. They had that. And so that's really the catching up that's necessary.
And then you go, and I was just going to say, you go far enough back, they actually had us to build their wealth, right? Like we were part of their wealth and we built their wealth.
Hello, they had us. That's right. We were an asset. Yeah. We were an asset ourselves. So we need solutions. As you talk about recommendations, we need those types of solutions that would allow us to catch up. And I notice you also have included reparations in your recommendation.
Yeah, no, I mean, reparations focused on African Americans would be the most cost-effective and time-efficient way to address this racial wealth divide. I'm all for broad universal policies like a baby bond program, which we put forward, which you could do to disproportionately hit African American, maybe Latino, Native American youth. But if you want to save dollars, focus it on, and that's what reparations would be. Reparations should be focused on the Black community and what we're going to do to bridge this inequality. So you can do baby bonds, particularly for African Americans. You could do home lending programs, or maybe do VA loans that do have 0% down payment for all African Americans or all African Americans who've been in the country for a certain amount of time, what have you. But that's the type of, reparations allows for a specificity and a focus of investment into our community. And then there's also other broad universal policies which could be helpful to bridge inequality overall and help our Latino or Native American brothers and sisters who also suffer from racial equity.
You mentioned too that the funding for reparations could come from taxes and fees levied on the ultra wealthy. But you also make the argument that concentrated wealth with the ultra wealthy needs to be broken up anyway, right?
No, 100%. I mean, I think one of the greatest challenges for African American economic empowerment has been that since we managed to break a lot of the outright segregation laws of the 40s and 50s, we had about 20 years of some type of semi-progressive economic policy, but by 1980, we were at full on tilt to a regressive economic policy. Regressive economic policy meaning that as the country's wealth grew, it went disproportionately to the wealthiest instead of going disproportionately to the poorest as it did in the 1940s, 50s, when the great white American middle class was created. So we definitely need a progressive economic future in order to help deal with inequality, including racial economic inequality.
You alluded to bonds, but tell us more about individual wealth building, family wealth building, individual asset building.
Yeah, I mean, I think, important thing to note is that, we can look at personal finance as how do we deal with the economic structures that, are around us, right? And what are best measures? You usually have to be pretty conservative when you don't have a lot. You got to be pretty conservative with what you have and really try to make sure you have oftentimes a rainy day fund, because the poorer you are, the less wealth you have, the more rain you have and the more economic crisis you have. And so most of your wealth is really just to help you get through economic crisis. Once you have a certain amount of income and you have a decent amount of wealth, you can then use that wealth to actually build wealth. And, and that's the space. And that's what we're trying to figure out is how can we get income and wealth into our community to a point that no longer are we just trying to have rainy day funds, but we actually have enough wealth that we can invest in our future and create more economic opportunity and have our wealth grow.
Universal health care is also one of IPS's and NCRC's recommendations. How important is universal health to achieving some type of economic parity?
Well, most analysis put forward that healthcare costs is the number one source of bankruptcy. So you can see how important it would be to not make that just a private responsibility, but a universal public asset that then means we don't have to drain our resources to deal with health crises, which disproportionately happen in our community. So we are more likely to deal with these healthcare costs, and we have the least in terms of our personal finances to actually pay for them. So I think we would see important economic benefits as well as health benefits, because a lot of the health issues we have is the stress of not just racism, but of economic insecurity. And I think having a universal program like healthcare, having maybe universal employment, all of that would help our health and our wealth.
Yeah, no, that's very important. Who else is the audience besides the general public? Is the audience policymakers? Are they in the audience? Do you have a sense the CBC annual legislative conference is coming up? Do you have a sense that policymakers are willing to take this document, take this report and carry the torch?
Yeah, my concern is that too many of our politicians are so caught up in the politics of a 2024 election, which is important, but they're concerned about, well, let's get through the election before we put forth policy. And, I would go back to, again, Dr. King's 1963 book, I believe it was 1963, Why We Can't Wait. Like, we can't wait for another election to pass or what have you. The time is now to put forth this economic crisis of Black America and demand that all candidates highlight what policies are they going to do that would get the country off of the path of waiting another 500 years before we have income inequality, or 780 years until we have wealth equality.
The report, 60 years after MLK's I Have a Dream speech, new report projects over 500 years to achieve Black economic equality. You can read it at ncrc.org, National Community Reinvestment Coalition, ncrc.org. Dedrick Asante Muhammad, one of the authors of the report. My brother, as always, we appreciate you and thank you for waking us up to how far we've come and how much further we need to go.
And I thank you for years of informing your audience of these important type of issues. So thank you.
Thank you, brother.
Thanks for getting woke and listening to Make It Plain. As always, perform an act of kindness on behalf of an elder or young person. Write a letter to a sister brother who just so happens to find her or himself incarcerated. Offer libations to the ancestors upon whose sturdy shoulders we all now stand. And above all, give thanks to the God of your understanding by whatever name you call her and him. All God asks of us is that we give each other love. Thanks for giving MIP love. And please remember to subscribe and give us a 5-star rating. If all hearts and minds are clear, it has been made plain.